Do you know what every FF14 mechanic in existence is? Stand and let thing resolve.
Stand and let thing resolve. By now, I think just about all of us have heard this phrase, courtesy of someone extremely bitter who, frankly, didn't deserve the attention we all gave him. But regardless of your feelings toward the current state of Final Fantasy XIV, this is no doubt a sentiment you have heard, and at least from what I've seen, people have tended to agree that you can pretty much boil down every mechanic in FF14 to this. Or at least, they can't explain the ways in which this isn't really accurate. And for me, I don't think it's a fair assessment. Not to say there aren't mechanics in the game that boil down to that, but even in those cases, it's pretty reductive, and I would say shows that you don't really understand what mechanics in this game are and are able to be. So, let's talk about what mechanics are able to be. Well, to do that, we need to break this down from the absolute most basic level. What are the ways that we as players can directly interact with an encounter? And there are two basic things we can do. We can move around, and we can press our skills. That's it. That's everything we're able to do. I mean, I guess if you want to nitpick, we can also do things like put away and take out our weapons, but in general, these two things are the main actions that we can take. What does this mean for mechanics? Well, movement translates into mechanics based on our positioning as players, and skills translate into controlling damage, both incoming and outgoing. So, with that, we have the three broad categories that mechanics can fall into. Positioning, our stand and let thing resolve, as it were, controlling the damage we're dealing by pressing the buttons that deal it, and controlling the damage we're taking by using healing skills to give us the HP to survive incoming damage, and mitigations to make sure that the amount of HP that players have will be sufficient to survive that incoming damage. I'd imagine just from that, most of you get the idea, but just to be safe, let's look at a few examples, and we'll start with positioning since it was the original focus of this discussion. You see an AoE marker on the ground, and you move out of it. That is positioning. You are about to be hit with a personal AoE, and you move away from other people so that it doesn't also hit them. Positioning. You have a debuff that you need to give to someone by standing on them, so you move to them to do so. Positioning. You need this web to hit another web, and have the combined area of those webs hit two poles to make a bridge to cross over a pool of poison, so you go over to one of those poles to make sure the web hits it. This is a bit more interesting in its presentation, but it is still positioning. As is going to a tower like this to soak damage, moving out of a twister, and all sorts of other stuff. You get the idea. Next, let's look at incoming damage. Raid wides, tank busters, targeted hits, even ground AoEs that aren't outright lethal. There's plenty of incoming damage to examine in its own right. And add on to that the different ways that damage can come, whether it's a single large hit, several smaller hits in a short time span, damage over time effects, where how hard it's going to hit is snapshotted when the effect starts, and you have our next category for mechanics. Because, yes, these things are mechanics. And not only that, but they can be combined with our previous category to make mechanics that have a bit more substance to them. A shared damage stack, for example, is both positioning in getting everyone in the area you need to be hit by it, and controlling the incoming damage to survive the hit. Wild charges, as we call them. The tank positions in front so they take the most damage, and you control that damage so that they and everyone behind them lives. Managing the damage your party is taking is just as much of a mechanic as anything else, often requiring similar levels of planning as the positioning mechanics do. And this is where I want to pause for a second, because that's the other part of the equation that's being ignored when we just say, stand and let thing resolve. Up to now, we've only been talking about the direct ways that we engage with encounters, but that doesn't tell the whole story. At the end of the day, raiding is an exercise in problem solving just as much, if not more, than it is an exercise in the buttons you're pressing. figuring out where those positions are that you need to stand so the thing resolves properly. Working out how much mitigation to use on this next raid wide or tank buster so that you'll still have what you need to survive the next one after it. Adjusting to the 7 other human beings, all of whom are capable of making mistakes that can result in the plan being thrown off course. Adjusting to the different variations of a mechanic that are given to you by the fight itself. There's a fair amount of thought that needs to go into completing these mechanics successfully, and usually a lot of movement as well. Probably too much for this complaint to really be worth any of the air it was given, but it's out there now, so here's my counter-argument. If you think that all that mechanics in this game are is stand and let thing resolve, you have missed the point of these fights and have apparently forgotten about all the running around you did to get to where you stood when the thing resolved. Now, do I think that we can improve things from here? Absolutely. And with Dawntrail just a few short weeks away at this point, I'm hoping that's something we'll see. But before we get into how I think the devs could do that, it's probably best to talk a little bit more about the final category of mechanics that we haven't touched yet. That category is managing outgoing damage. Sadly, this is one that I really feel has gone underused lately, with most of what we've seen recently just being damage over the course of a whole fight. But while, yes, DPS checks are the main way this type of mechanic is expressed, there is enough potential variance there for this to be worth talking about. We've seen other types of DPS checks, shorter term ones where you need to do a lot of damage in a few GCDs like Titan Jails in Uwu, and medium-term ones where, over the course of a minute or two, you need to defeat an ad or a series of ads. And that's another part of this, the number of targets available at once determining what is optimal in how you deal your damage. If it's using AoE skills to hit several targets, if it's blowing your single target burst to drop that single target quickly, if it's a small number of targets that you can put stronger damage over time skills on. You handle all of these in different ways. And by combining a few of these and making players consider each in the wider scope of a fight, you can create encounters that are much more interesting. But again, in at least the past 2 Savage tiers, the only thing that's mattered on this front is the DPS check of a full fight. That said, if we go back to the start of the expansion, there's a fight that I would say uses DPS checks to their fullest potential as a mechanic, and shows that it can work even in our existing 2-minute meta world. Phoenix, of course, had a mild overall DPS check that you needed to think about at least a little bit, but also had an ad phase with more birds to test medium-term damage, and a short-term check with the Blackfires about a minute into the encounter. And while we're talking about the bird, let's go back and look at how well it used the other types of mechanics. Incoming damage? Between the Death's Toll / Life's Agonies check, where everyone needed to take lethal damage and then get healed back up to full, to the increased healing that you get from the fountains that was required to survive an upcoming raid wide, it did some really interesting things. And those mechanics also factored in player positioning in a pretty substantial way, to say nothing of how it mattered in the ad phase with the dashes. But even more noteworthy than that is how it's not just player positioning that mattered, but also the positioning of the boss itself. Another tragically underused factor in more recent raids. You had to move the boss around so that players could keep uptime through things like the plus through the middle and the glory plumes, and even for the start of the fight, it could matter a lot. But unfortunately, this has been so absent from Savage in the past couple raid tiers, due largely to the massive increase in boss hitbox sizes, that Yoshi P even made light of the situation back at PAX a few months ago. Now, sadly, even ultimates I feel these days are kind of lacking when it comes to boss positioning, but if we look at DSR, it does have good usage of different types of DPS check mechanics. Stuff like Nidstinian and the Eyes phases are more medium-term checks. The meteors in Death of the Heavens are more of a short-term check, and you still need to manage your resources throughout to make sure that you have the damage to finish the final 2 phases. And when you look at a lot of the mechanics in DSR, they combine these 3 concepts in engaging and satisfying ways all the way through. There's a reason it's my favorite fight in the game. But is that really all there is? Are all mechanics for the rest of 14's lifespan just going to be combinations of these three things? Well, no, at least they don't have to be. To tell the truth, back at the start of the video, I lied. And some of you may have realized it, especially as I brought up DSR. There's another kind of button we have available to press that has nothing to do with incoming or outgoing damage. DSR actually makes us use a few of these. Anti-knockbacks, stuns, interrupts, really all kinds of crowd control, and even the less popular idea of duty actions. This is another class of mechanics that, outside of very rare examples, have fallen to the wayside in recent years. And being honest, I understand why. With a lot of these things, the way they were used largely boils down to press this button at X time or you die. Didn't stun the Dread Knight in Coil turn 5? That player's dead. Didn't silence Adelfel's heal in the first part of DSR? Just wall it, he's gonna enrage. And let's not forget the garbage that was the duty action in Lakshmi that made the extreme version easier than the normal mode because you had 3 stacks of a press this to ignore mechanics button. But we've also seen all of these ideas be used well. Catastrophe's gravity gimbal, where you sometimes needed to be in the air and it wasn't always the same people at the same time who needed to use it. That was engaging. Coordinating CC in Shiva's ad phase to make sure you could meet the DPS check. That was good. Even the anti-knockback in DSR, you had to know when to use it so that it wouldn't expire before the knockback hit, and when not to use it if you needed to take the knockback to get to your tower. And that's to say nothing of the possibilities that I've seen with these ideas in other games. I look back at Wildstar, where we had to coordinate interrupts to create burst damage phases through the interrupt armor and moment of opportunity systems, where we had duty actions to pull our friends off a platform that was about to crumble beneath them, to do a Simon minigame of matching the order of the colors the boss showed, but each player has a different color for their duty action, to throw a battery on the ground into a generator to bring the boss back down after it flies away, to fly into the air ourselves and collect a buff to let us break a shield that was preventing the boss from taking damage. Obviously, not all of these ideas would work super well in 14, but they show us that there is a way to use these abandoned concepts to make encounters that are even more engaging than what we already have. And that's what I want to see. With those 3 main categories, the dev team have shown that they're more than capable of combining rather simple concepts into mechanics and encounters that are interesting and fun to figure out and execute. And I have complete faith that if they bring back some of these underutilized concepts, they'll be able to mix those in to take encounters to a whole new level, give smaller hitboxes so boss positioning is a real factor, make us use interrupts but combine them with other things so it's not just a tacked on press this button now to live. Experiment with duty actions again with that same idea. Give us other types of DPS checks and make us do all these things while trying to meet those checks. And thankfully, to some extent, it seems the dev team agrees. In a recent interview with Hardcore Gamer done during the Dawntrail media tour, and actually I've seen a few other interviews from the media tour that express similar sentiments, Yoshi P expressed that specifically in Savage, he had noticed that mechanics had started to become more similar to each other in recent years, and that in Dawntrail, the team wants to shift back to before that started happening and bring in, quote, more unique elements. Going into this video, I had 2 goals. One was to dispel the idea that mechanics in FF14 can be entirely boiled down to stand and let thing resolve. There's just so much more to the encounters that we have, even in Endwalker, than this oversimplified whining. But the other was to show that mechanics can go beyond what we currently have, that we can do more interesting things than the dev team have been willing to try until now, but also to make it clear how that can actually be done. Criticism is one thing, but unless it's constructive, unless you can explain why a change would be better and how that change might even work, there's no value in it. And so, I hope in all of this, I've provided some value to you, the viewers, and to the dev team. Thanks for watching. Throw me a sub if you want to see more discussions like this. I've definitely got a few more in the tank. And I'll see y'all in the next one.